Rifle and Spade is grand tactical World War I combat. So line of sight is critical because artillery and machine gun fire depends on line of sight. Here you can see the two maps, Gallipoli, already published, and Mons, currently in pre-order. This is a situation around Anzac Cove. Historically, the Ottoman artillery was set up on this ridgeline and they could see as far as here but no further. You need line of sight to show that. The Ottoman counterattacks were able to take advantage of the quite crowded terrain in here to get close to the Anzac line. And in fact, the Anzacs had the same situation. They could move around. A simple wedding cake model for line of sight wouldn't allow that. And alternatively, a rise over run, besides being fiddly, blocks more lines of sight than were actually blocked in reality. So you need to have quite a rich set of rules for it to work. With Mons, you've got its own situation. These slag heaps here are much higher than the surrounding terrain. The British historically had their artillery behind the slag heaps. They couldn't see, and the Germans were able to move up quite close to the front line of the British. Conversely, the German artillery had trouble with these quite crowded terrain in here and couldn't see. So line of sight matters in Mons. In the historical situation, the artillery has a limited effect on the battle. In the hypothetical meeting engagement, which generally occurs on the more open eastern end, the lines of sight are open and they get to see much further and they have a bigger effect. What I'll do now is walk through the particular cases in the line of sight rules, primarily using Mons, but then jumping back to Gallipoli when it's a Gallipoli specific rule. The colour scheme used for both maps is the same colour scheme that's used in a standard atlas or a relief map. In other words, the low levels are in a dark green, which goes all the way through to a light green, then a pale yellow, and up through tans all the way to orange. So if we zoom out here in Mons, you can see that the city itself is in the dark green area, so it's at low level. There's a ridge here in the light green, and then down here we go up towards the higher ground. Now, of course, this being Belgium, these are only 10 metre contour intervals, so i.e. 33 feet, so we're not looking at mountains. But there, for example, behind Mons, you can see By La Haute, the high woods, which dominates the local terrain. Here you can see the same colour scheme being used on the Gallipoli map. This is published, so the colours are brighter and better balanced, but the same idea. The coast, of course, lowest level, this being sea level, and then going up through here all the way up along the ridge to the highest point at Kota Chementeb, also known as Hill 971. If you zoom out a little bit here, you can see the very important terrain around Anzac Cove, these two ridges, and this which chunk by air, which connects the two ridges, and then the eventual first day target. The line of sight procedure is printed both in the charts and tables and also in the main rulebook. In this case, here's the charts and tables, playtest material for Mons. The published version, of course, will look much better. Rifle and Spade has three kinds of line of sight effects. Most games only have two, which is blocked and open, but Rifle and Spade also has partial. Partial allows you to take a shot, but the line of sight is somewhat obscured, so the fire is not as effective. The way the procedure works is that you look at your two units, the spotter and the target, and you always work from whoever is at the higher elevation towards the lower. If they're at equal elevation, then you can choose either end. You work down the list until you get a result. So often you'll get blocked or stopped rather quite early, and you stop the procedure. So let's look at two units. So here we have a German and a British infantry unit adjacent to each other. Now, the first thing that applies is, are they within observation range? Observation range is affected by light. It's the only thing. So at night you can only see into your own hex. If it's twilight, you can see adjacent. During daytime, it's unlimited. Some games, for example, Mons has thin mist, and that limits you, in this case, to 6 hexes. Gallipoli, there was no weather during the actual battle, so in that case it's only day, twilight and night that matter. So Step 1, which rarely applies, is if the target hex is not within observation range, it's blocked, which typically means that it's night or twilight. Next, assuming that they're within observation range, then are they at range 0, meaning they're in the same hex, or range 1, which means they're just immediately adjacent? If they are, it's open. Now the rationale for this is that, of course, units are not sitting on the exact center of each hex. There's several hundred men, they're spread out in the hex, and they will be able to find a way to see the opposing unit, which is either exactly in the same hex, i.e. within 400 meters, or perhaps adjacent. So you can't be obscured if you're that close. Next, this one is the obvious case of a hill. So let me move across and we'll find a hill. Now point 3 says that if the line of sight crosses a hex or a non-adjacent hex site that has an effective elevation higher than both the spotter and target, then it's blocked. In other words, if you try to see through something in the middle that's higher than both endpoints, you're blocked. Here's the classic example. German artillery on the right here, British infantry on the left, and they're passing through a hill here which is higher than both, so they're blocked. Could be other reasons. For example, if we put them over here, they pass through the ridge. Ridge adds 1 to the effective elevation on either side, so that it's also blocked. Now notice this is where the non-adjacent comes in. If the German artillery unit was adjacent to the ridge, then it would not be blocked because the hex site is adjacent. The model here, of course, is the German artillery wants to be able to shoot, so they have moved themselves up to the edge of the ridge and are shooting and have their observers there. Other things that can block, these woods add to the elevation. So if we had the German artillery here in the village, British infantry on the other side, they would not be able to see each other because the woods adds 1 to the elevation of the hex. So moving on to point 4, which is very similar, if the line of sight crosses a hex that contains blocking terrain that has a base elevation the same as both spotter and target, then it's blocked. Now, if you look at the terrain effects chart, things like fields, villages are blocking, but they don't actually add to the base elevation because they're only a few meters high. So let's look at some examples on the map here. So here we have some fields, some farmland, sorry. If we had the German artillery and the British infantry with that between it, they're both at the same elevation. This is blocking terrain, so therefore they can't see each other. The same would apply with a village hex. For example, if the British infantry were there, German artillery here, the village is at the same height as both of them, and so it blocks. Equally, the ridge would block, although in that case it's actually elevated. So, point 5. This introduces the concept of military crests, and this is where the line of sight becomes interesting. Now, if the line of sight crosses a military crest, remember we always start from the higher, so we're tracing from the higher, we go over a military crest, then the line of sight is blocked to the next immediate hex below that crest. So let's just stop there and have a look. So here we have an example of military crest. We have the British artillery. They're up quite high. They're higher than this blocking terrain, so they can see over all of that. However, if we put the German unit here on the downside of the military crest, they cannot be seen by the British artillery. Now, if they're back a little bit, they could be. In Gallipoli, there's another thing called downslope blocking terrain, which I'll cover in a little later in the video, but for the moment, in Mons, it's only the immediate lower hex. Now, why is that? Let me draw you a picture. So here's a diagram. We've got the artillery, the fire on top of the hill, and the target is down here at the bottom. And this point here is a military crest. It's also known as a concave slope, or a false top, or a rollover. The problem is well, from the artillery's point of view, but not from the infantry's point of view, is that the line of sight is blocked by that. The actual definition of a military crest is the point at which you can see the bottom of the hill. So if the artillery wanted to defend against this particular point at the bottom of the hill, they would have to be here. So if we come back here, the situation is that this here is actually a concave slope, and the British artillery can't see it. Now, if you're good at reading more contour maps, you can see it, but what I've done here is I've gone around the whole map and I've put in the military crests, so you don't have to be an expert at reading contour maps. The same thing applies in Gallipoli. Now let's look at military crests in Gallipoli. Gallipoli has a terrain type that Mons does not, the downslope blocking or DSB hex. It represents a very tangled terrain type with lots of gullies which obscure the line of sight to units. Now this point 6 in the Gallipoli rules is complicated, so we'll look at it in 3 sections. First we'll look at military crests, then we'll look at contours, and then we'll look at the second part, which is shooting across a valley. This point 6 is not printed in Mons because Mons doesn't have the downslope blocking hex, so no point printing a rule that does not apply. Here you can see the 2 kinds of downslope blocking hex terrain in Gallipoli. There's the scrub hexes and then steep scrub hexes. Here is a typical situation around Anzac Cove. We have Ottoman artillery on the high ground attempting to shoot downslope towards an advancing Anzac unit. So here it's shooting over a military crest. Now in this case it's blocked because the line of sight crosses a military crest and the target unit is in a continuous line of downslope blocking hexes back to the military crest. So what this represents is shooting over a rollover or a military crest, and the target unit is lost in the set of gullies below. Now let's suppose the artillery unit was here. Now in that case it's still blocked to the Anzac unit for 2 reasons. One, it's directly below the military crest, and secondly it's in a contiguous line of downslope blocking hexes to it. But if the Australian was further back here, the line of sight would not be blocked because it is no longer in a downslope blocking hex. Just to go over that, the key point is that if they're in downslope blocking hexes, once you cross a military crest, the line of sight is blocked all the way along until you get out into clear terrain. Here we look at the case where the line of sight crosses over a contour line into a downslope blocking hex. So once again we have the Ottoman artillery on the high ground shooting downhill, in this case crossing contour line changes. The line of sight is partial to the Australian unit anywhere along this contiguous line of downslope blocking hexes. Now if the Australian were here, it would be blocked due to the final military crest. Here, now it would be open because there are no downslope blocking hexes in this section. So the lesson is that line of sights are difficult when you're in downslope blocking areas. Military crests block it completely, contour change makes it partial. So this is very important in the fighting around Anzac Cove. So here we look at the last part of point 6, which is shooting across a valley. So let's read the whole rule again. If the line of sight crosses a military crest to a lower downslope blocking hex, then check all the hexes along the line of sight below the crossed military crest. So here's the military crest. We'll check all these hexes here. If any of these checked hexes is not a downslope blocking hex, well, they all are, so we continue, or it has an elevation the same or higher than the lower side of the crossed military crest, then we would skip it. So here's the military crest. The lower side is the bottom of this valley. The target unit is above the bottom of the valley, therefore we skip this case. It's not blocked, it's actually open. The wording can be a little bit complicated, but what's going on in real life is, of course, here it's shooting down the military crest into its tangled terrain. It can't see at the bottom of the valley. As soon as the Australian unit is up the other side of the valley, then the Ottoman is looking over the top of all of that terrain and can see it. This is exactly the same for a contour. If we're dealing with contour changes, then it'd normally be partial to the bottom of the valley, but here it would be open because the rise here gets it out of the bottom of the valley. Here again we look at a diagram. So we have the fire up on an elevation, it crosses over a contour line or a military crest. Fire to the bottom would either be partial or blocking, depending whether this was a military crest or a contour. But up, once you get to the target, is up on the other side of the valley, then the line of sight is not blocked or partial, in fact it is open. Visualizing the situation always helps. Moving back to Mons, let's look at the screening terrain type. This is a terrain type that Gallipoli does not have. What it represents is terrain that is not completely blocking. You can see some distance into it. The terrain types in Mons that are screening are willow beds, farmland, and the village, which is a lot of the map, to be honest. So here we have a case where the British are filling their oats. They come across the canal and they're trying to move up the hill towards a German artillery unit. So in the Mons rules, point 6 covers screening terrain. So if the line of sight is between hexes at two different elevations, and that's critical, you have to have the artillery up on a hill, and it crosses a screening terrain hex, well here it does, the farmland is screening terrain, then it's open into the first hex, partial into the second, let's see, open, partial, and blocked into any subsequent contiguous non-open hexes. So let's do that again. If the British, in this case it's the 1st Battalion, the Black Watch, were here, then it'd be open into the first screening hex, partial into the second screening hex, and then blocked into third and subsequent. Now an open hex resets the count, so if he were over here, open, partial, now it's back into an open hex, so the line of sight is open, open, first hex open, and then it would be partial, blocked, etc., going further back. So if you have a situation where you've got screening terrain with little open areas in the middle, the open areas in the middle are dangerous because the unit will be forced to come out in the open, and believe me, there is a lot of artillery at Mons. You don't want to be moving in the open without being very careful about what you're doing. So let's look at case 7 in the Mons numbering, which is case 8 in Gallipoli. Because of the addition of downslope blocking in Gallipoli, there's an extra number there. What this case covers is where the situation where you have some ridge in the middle of the line of sight that's not high enough to block it, and the result will be partial. So looking at the exact wording, if the line of sight between hexes at two different elevations, and that's the case here, crosses a ridge that is not adjacent to either the spotter or the target, again it's in the middle, and the elevation of the ridge is no higher than the higher unit and not equal to or lower than the lower. Now a ridge of course adds 1 to the effective elevation of both sides, so this ridge is at the same height as the spotter, which means it's no higher, and it's above the target unit. So therefore case 7 applies, and this is a partial line of sight. The situation in the real world is that you've got a ridge in the middle that's giving a partially obscured line of sight to that target hex. This situation often occurs around Anzac Cove because you've got large hills. It doesn't often show in Mons, which is why I'm not using the Mons map, and it doesn't show at Cape Helles because Helles is fairly flat. Point 8 doesn't often come up, but it's in there to cover the case where a unit pops up out of blocked terrain. It's momentarily visible because it's crossing over a ridge. So let's look at an example here using the Gallipoli map, again because it's got more ridges in the Mons map. The German infantry here is blocked because the line of sight to the German infantry is blocked because it crosses this military crest here, and this is a contiguous line of downslope blocking hexes. However, if the German infantry were to move over that, then that ridge, of course, is 1 higher than this terrain, so it's the same height as this hex. Therefore, for opportunity fire only, it's visible as it crosses that ridge. So that's the line of sight in a nutshell. There are quite a few points, but as I said, it gets you around the problem of having to do rise over run and actually gives you accurate results. If you use rise over run, then the lines of sight are more blocked than they were historically, and you can't actually recreate the historical situations that occurred. At that point, the game is a failure. So it has to be able to recreate what was actually seen. In practice, you remember it pretty quickly. The first one is just about light. If it's night or twilight, you can only see in your same hex or adjacent. Second one, if it's daylight, you can always see adjacent. The third one, Well, you can't shoot over hills or woods or anything else that's really high, or slag heaps in Mons. When you get down to military crests, you can't see to the hex immediately below the military crest or to a contiguous line of downslope blocking hexes. Screening, if one guy up is up on the hill, then you can see open into the first, partial into the second, and blocked into the third. Seventh one is about shooting downhill across ridges that are not high enough to completely block the line of sight. They give you partial. This one comes up more in Gallipoli. And then number 8 is about, well, if they've actually popped up briefly because they're crossing a ridge which takes them out of the terrain mess, then you get a shot for the opportunity fire. So if you get all the way through all these cases and none of them apply, then it is open. In other words, the default is the line of sight is open unless one of these cases applies and it's blocked or partial. And that's line of sight. Mons 1914, The Mad Minute, is available for pre-order from gmtgames.com.